Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show of the Western Standard. With me today is one-time Liberal MP Dan McTeague. Now he is the president of the Canadians for Affordable Energy, and we're going to be talking about the plans of the Liberal government to make us net zero by 2035. I think it can't be done. I'm going to ask Mr. McTeague whether he thinks it can be done. We're going to have some fun with this one. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Great to be here, Nigel. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here in the Western Standard and the Hannaford show. Hopefully, we'll do more of this down the road.
Well, Dan, it's an honor to have you, too. I don't think everybody would necessarily know that for 18 years you were a member of Parliament. You were actually a Liberal member of Parliament. And I have to ask you, before we even get into this, is this the Liberal Party you knew?
Not at all. It's completely foreign to anybody who spent time with the Liberal Party. And by the way, my lineage to the party goes back to 1974. When I was a 12-year-old, I was licking envelopes for the Honorable Hugh Faulkner, the real environment minister back in the day. Worked again for Paul Cosgrove in 1979, 78, and 1980. Again in 1984 and ran in 1993 and was successful after running campaigns for several other Liberals. So my tenure in the party is extraordinarily deep, and I can say with absolute certainty this is not the same Liberal Party, balanced, pragmatic party of the center that try to straddle issues and try to find consensus and a common purpose in its policies. It is very much a left-wing construct, and I would classify it as more of a left-wing branch of the NDP than it is, of course, the Liberal Party that I knew and that so many of us have come to know as the pragmatic party of the center. So no, not at all. And I'm not afraid to say so and to dispute its legitimacy as the Liberal Party.
Dan, that kind of confirms the suspicions that a lot of us have had out west for quite a long time. I'm glad to see that it's penetrating in the east as well. But anyway, one of the things that this progressive Liberal Party has been trying to do is to take us to a net zero carbon emissions by 2035. And one of the ways they mean to do that is to switch us all over to driving electric vehicles by that time. What a lot of people don't realize is that they are phasing that in early, and that as soon as, and I need to consult my notes here, in less than 18 months by law, 1/5 of all new passenger cars sold in Canada have to be electric. And I think by 2030, which is only this could be your next car. And by 2030, it has to be up to 60%. Now, if we're going to have that many electric cars on the road, where is the power coming from? Because at the same time they're doing this, they're bringing, new population into Canada. Everybody who comes in is going to want to turn on the lights, cook their meals. We need a huge amount of electricity, and yet I don't see any new construction of baseload generation. Yes, there's all kinds of solar panels, there's all kinds of things that only work when the wind blows, but I don't see the baseline generation coming. So this looks like absolute chaos of objectives to me. How does it look to you?
It looks like bad central planning, and we've never seen that work anywhere in the world, even under its previous iterations under communism in Russia or in China. Look, the reality is that we don't have the power needed to meet that objective, assuming that plan were to work. The fact is these things are out of reach for most people, most Canadians. And most Canadians, whether you are here in Ontario or in Western Canada or in the East, our climate simply does not permit this kind of vehicle to be taken up with any great zeal. Forget the cost aside. So for planners, central planners working the bureaucracy in Ottawa, once former activists for various organizations, scaling the CN Tower or Ralph Klein's house. The reality is that these people should not be in a position of advocating any type of timeline because they can't possibly meet it. And by any realistic measure, which of course demonstrates the extent to which this Liberal Party has become bereft of reality and, as I said earlier, pragmatism, they're imposing ridiculous goals that cannot possibly be met. In fact, this morning, even the parliamentary budget officer said, not only are you not going to reach those goals, but right now, for most Canadians, to reach that goal of 60%, as you mentioned, in 2030, you're going to have to ensure that the price of electric vehicle drops 31%. That isn't going to happen, not without the massive subsidies it takes to build, not without the massive subsidies it takes to create infrastructure, not without the massive subsidies to incent people to actually drive these things. The reality is that even if they were to get them, sell them as used, they're not worth it. And we well know now that most common sense manufacturers globally, auto manufacturers, are walking away from this in droves. Nigel, I live no more than 3 kilometers away from the Ford plant here in Oakville. This was $1 billion given to that company, federal and provincial money. They've walked away from it. They threw out 2,700 workers, said they're going to bring in the EV. Now they've decided not to do it. Instead, they're bringing in what people really want, the F-250 Super Duty, and that's going to start in 2026, not EVs. This reality, I think, is now starting to shower the Liberals and those out there who believe in their own press releases that somehow they can make these things happen with massive amounts of borrowed money and without infrastructure to support it. As you mentioned, not just infrastructure to produce energy, but also to distribute that. Who's going to build and get the distribution boxes? What kind of mining are we going to need to achieve those goals? The reality is it's not practical, and it's the kind of stuff of fantasy that I think magic and make believe is no way to conduct public policy, and that's one of the reasons I believe the federal Liberal Party and its planners are doomed in the next 12 months, and there will be a replacement government where common sense once again remains the stead in Canada.
Well, that point you made actually about the secondary distribution system, it's not just the big overhead lines that take power lines that take the power. It's also the stuff underground that takes the power from the transformer into your own house. The little community I live in is a transformer serving 40 homes. The first guy who wants to plug in an electric vehicle is going to be all right. Probably the second one too. The third one, it's going to affect people's freezers. So I have real, he's not going to be a popular guy. So, but look, if I'm not an expert in this, you are. If between us, however, we can see that this is an impossible dream, is it the case that they don't see this in central government, or that they see it and just don't know what else to do, so blindly barrel on?
I think it's a lack of, it's a question of don't look before you leap. And they've done that. They've done so because in the United States, the Biden administration, now on its way out, at least Biden, from what I can see, made a decision to invest trillions of dollars in terms of the Inflation Recovery Act, Reduction Act. And what that basically meant was the federal Canadian government would have to, with the provincial government hopping on board, and other governments across the country, would use this as an opportunity to as it were, pillage the finances of this country in order to achieve goals that are simply impossible to meet. Look, spending $52 billion or committing that kind of money to get $19 billion from investments from automotive manufacturers isn't going to work. And it's not a very good, way of conducting public policy. If in fact you're incenting people 2 to 1 for every dollar they're investing, you're giving them back 2. I don't know whose math or what financial creative juices go into the minds of those who've made this idea, but it's an impossible demand. And it's based really on what I think is a very undefined, I would almost say fraudulent discussion about what net zero really is. If you're saying that carbon is bad for the world, when in fact it's not a pollution, it's in fact the giver of life. It provides the greening of and the quality of our life. If you're saying that you want to get rid of that and at the same time bankrupt nations and force people into vehicles and to do things that they can't do and to somehow stunt growth and development, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. And those who are advocating it are absolutely mad and insane and have no business in public policy, nor should they be anywhere near advocating changes that I think are leading everyone to the conclusion this country is going in a very wrong direction. Okay, now you mentioned a moment ago that you reminded us that there's an election coming up in next year, and there could be a change of government. Now, one of the things that we know about big business is that once they get committed to a certain course of action, it's like the oil tanker analogy. It takes a lot to turn it around. And can you conceive of a situation in which big business is pleased enough to see a different government with better ideas, but doesn't even move the wheel, doesn't even try to turn because they are afraid that the investments that they make today or next year, 4 years later, would be at risk
because of a return of whether it's the Liberals or the NDP or somebody else altogether who has the same kinds of destructive ideas that you have just characterized as a disaster.
Well,
Can we rely on something new if there's a change of government?
I think manufacturers are already signaling that they're walking away from this. I mean, Ford Motor Company is no small, company. Has been a very significant, has a great, proud tradition. It's privately held. Has never asked government for loans or bailouts because they've gone bankrupt not once but twice, as Stellantis, which is formerly Chrysler, or as say GM has done. These are companies that are along with Mercedes, Toyota, the company I worked for several years before being elected as a member of Parliament in public relations, said, no, listen, we think that the best penetration would be 30% EV market. That's it. We are not going in that direction. We're going to try to provide other solutions based around fossil fuels, maybe even a bit of hydrogen, who knows? But they're not going to put their eggs in one basket. Ford has said pretty much the same thing. Unless they can produce a vehicle that makes money from the get-go, the moment that car drives off the lot with a new buyer, they're not going to invest in EVs, no matter how many inducements the federal and governments on both sides of the border are prepared to make. So I think it's become a fool's errand for those who did not look before they left, basically jumped into this without taking into consideration the long-term impacts. And that's not just the federal government. The provincial government in my province, for instance, has made similar silly commitments in order to try to prevent and to uphold what has been the strength of our economy, the automotive sector, while completely sacrificing the reality of consumers not being able to make ends meet, and recognizing that the world does in fact want and will continue to need internal combustion engines as they meet a certain criteria that cannot be met by driving around electric toasters or whatever kind of widget you want to call it. I mean, it's not practical. There's a reason why 100 years ago society walked away from the EV. And it did so because it was not the kind of thing that one could commonly use day in, day out. Batteries are not like internal combustion engines. They do not have the density, they do not have the energy properties. At the same time, they're also extraordinarily cost efficient relative to any other alternative methods. And so unless someone has deep pockets and money that grows off trees, I know that's the NDP and the current liberal left ideology. But I think reality is starting to hit our politicians and planners right between the eyes, and to recognize that they got this thing awfully wrong.
I wonder if that reality really is hitting them between the eyes. I'm sure many of them have realized this, but the ideologues at the top, and I guess Mr. Guilbeault would be one. Mr. Guilbeault, who, by the way, famously within the last year said that they weren't going to issue more money for road construction, as though the need for roads was going to disappear. I wonder if people who think as he does would be so distressed if there were less cars on the road and people didn't travel so far. Do you have any suspicion that there may be a strand of that thinking in their decisions?
Very much so. There is an attempt to try to clamp down on our freedoms. These are bad news bears. These are Debbie Downers who do not like the fact the population has been very successful. Canada has been very wealthy, driven by its economic diversity, its energy diversity. Look, my province runs on electricity through power plants, through nuclear power plants. Your province through fossil fuels energy, and thank goodness. Because I can tell you, between the two of them, we have not only cheap energy, we have the revenues to let governments know that they can sustain this kind of social programs that Canadians take for granted in many cases, but cannot do so when we consider that clamping down on the very things that make our country attractive and lucrative. When you deny the world the things that Canada has, it's only Canadians who wind up carrying the cost of this. And so I think there's a real pushback to the fanatics and the activists who've been promoting their wares. By the way, grifting has been another problem. These are organizations that go out and tell us as to how they think we should operate as a society, but are the first ones to put their hands out to receive tens of millions, if not billions of dollars in charity monies or direct contributions by the federal, provincial, municipal governments. That money doesn't grow off trees. It comes ironically from the oil and gas sector, which produces about $25 billion net dollars every year for the federal, provincial, municipal government. So the irony isn't lost. It may not be lost on Western Canadians, but it's now becoming a growing reality in the eastern part of this country, especially in Ontario here, where people have had enough. They're fed up. And like maritime Canada, where we saw an increase in carbon taxes last summer, it coincided, ironically, with the turn in the electoral fortunes of Mr. Poilievre against Mr. Trudeau and his sidekick, Mr. Singh.
I want you to just do a little informed speculation here, Dan. If the government were in a position, let's just say they won the next election, so we had another 4 years of Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Guilbeault, and all who sail in them, and they are sitting there with the dilemma that in order for their grand plans to put more electric cars on the road to be realized, they're going to let Chinese imports in and basically kill Ford, Stellantis, and General Motors in Ontario. Is that a decision that they would make?
Well, I think it's a reality that they're going to have to confront, because that's exactly what's happened. Look, China made a move 15, 18 years ago to move towards electric vehicles because it could not penetrate or break through the iron wall of North American and European internal combustion engines. Not only to make them well, they made them efficiently. They're completely recyclable, they're cost effective, and they're the way of the future. As long as we're prepared to continue to recognize that we need energy to grow our economies, then that could be met. But China has no interest in going that road, because they know that that road would take them to a certain dead end. And now they have vehicles that they can't sell in their own country, so they want to dump them on the rest of the world. I mean, if we want these prices to come down, we're going to have to allow the Chinese to, sell, Geely. They're going to have to sell their BYDs and their other, even their Teslas, in order to bring these prices back to a level where I think people can find them as competitive as an alternative. That's not going to happen. The Prime Minister made it very clear, as did the United States. The answer is no. Tariffs are 100%. Trudeau had to make a decision. Does he obey China, or does he obey the United States? And given all the money that he's wasted building an infrastructure, an industry that will not work, and that these are simply dogs that will not hunt. Canadians do not want electric vehicles. Yeah, you got 10, 15% of there who are always going to be trendy and willing to try anything, provided they get some grift and some money. But when it comes at the expense of an economy that is deteriorating, there's no way under the sun any Canadian in their right mind will want to buy one of those things, recognizing they don't live in California or Southern California. They live in cold Canada. I don't need to say that to people in Alberta, but increasingly here in Ontario, anywhere north of Toronto is cold.
Yes. Well, and that, of course, is the fear here in Alberta, that if 10% of your new vehicle fleet has to be electric, then there's going to be a lot of competition for the 90%, because for all the reasons you've just articulated, nobody's going to want the 10%, except those people who kind of live 2 miles from their office. And, you could do it with a golf cart, I guess. But for most people, that's not the option. You're living in, I don't know, Grand Prairie or Coombe or something like that. And you've got 40 miles to go from where you live to where you work. Yep. And it's 30 below, and your little electric car, even if it keeps running for that length of time, you're going to be frozen like an icicle when you get there. So they're not going to want to buy the EV, but for every 9 people, there's got to be one. And then in 2030, it's 60-40. So what's this going to, you are in the car business, what's this going to do to the price of new cars? Or second-hand cars?
Cars will remain high. Price of used vehicles will be nonsense. We know batteries don't last as long as internal combustion engines. Look, I have a vehicle outside, a 2003 Chevy Silverado, 5.3 liter engine. It's going to go to 600, 700,000 kilometers as long as I keep the oil changed every 6,000 kilometers. Mm-hmm. The same cannot be said for your batteries. And it depends really. If we're talking the lithium battery, by the way, an invention that came from the oil sector itself. Exxon developed that technology many, many generations ago. But if anybody believes that that's the way we're going to see our future, forget it. Your mining, your agriculture, your heavy lifting, your airlines, your trains, nothing is going to, they might run a hybrid, but they're certainly not going to run straight EV. And to suggest, as some have, that we have the infrastructure necessary to accommodate that massive increase is delusional beyond comprehension. Those who are suggesting this aren't just dreamers. These people are insane, and we ought not to be following them. If anything, I think the next government is going to have to spend 4 years sifting through the debris and the damage of what is left by a government that had no option but to simply say, We're going to spend public money. We're going to indebt the nation to the point that it becomes apparent, I think, to everyone except for our bond rating agencies, who should be downgrading Canada's credit. I'm not saying that because I want that to happen. I just think that they're so woke they don't recognize you cannot use the CPP to leverage the amount of debt this country has incurred. I say that as a Liberal member of Parliament because we had to fight that massive debt. We did a lot of very unpopular things to get that debt under control. And if people think this is a joke, just wait till it only takes one credit agency to come out and say Canada's credit rating is not worthy. It cannot support itself. We better be selling a hell of a lot more oil and natural gas in order for this country to pay off the massive debts that is incurred in this flight of fantasy, believing that we could wokefully go down this road of ESG, net zero, the Great Reset, and bring about this idea that everybody should be driving electric toasters. Electric vehicles. It's the same thing.
Let me ask you this. We're sort of coming to the end of our time, but I would put it to you, Dan, that if you care about freedom, and you said you did about 5 minutes ago, you talked about the damage to personal freedoms, I would say the ability to jump in your car and go wherever you want without any permission from anybody is one of the foundational definitions of freedom. And it's perhaps a lot more useful than a vote in the sense that it's something you do every day. What do you think of that as a definition of freedom? And secondly, it is one of the pleasant things we do at the weekends. We jump in the car and we go somewhere. We go to the mountains, we go skiing. We go for a drive around the lakes. We go for we go to visit a friend who lives 100 miles away.
Well, transportation is...
We will still be able to do that?
Yeah, I think Nigel, I think transportation is an integral part of our lives and our society, not just to connect with each other, but also to have that freedom to move around. The government has made no secret of the fact, the federal government, that it wants 15-minute cities, that it does want to control how much you drive, how much you eat, what you eat. There's a whole litany of things that go into this rubric of net zero. The fact, as I mentioned earlier, these are real depressing people who believe that society, should not advance, should not grow, and should somehow be constrained because we're doing inordinate damage to the environment. The reality is far different than that, and I think we're far more environmentally responsible. That's a word I don't hear a lot of Liberals talk about these days. This Liberal government, they only want to talk about CO2 and carbon. They don't want to talk about other environmental issues, remediation, what's needed to resolve, to improve our air quality or the health of Canadians, the quality of our lakes, our rivers. Instead, it gives permits to cities like Montreal to go dump sewage into the Great Lakes and into the St. Lawrence River. Look, I think they got it all backwards. There isn't a single thing that these people have touched. They have the Midas touch in reverse. Everything they've touched has turned to garbage. And I think that's the problem, is that it's going to take a long time to repair and get these things back up and running. But make no mistake, limiting your ability to exercise a quality of life that is enviable around the world is something they want to go after. And it's the result of that I think this Liberal government and its friends, its coalition friends in the NDP, are doomed for political annihilation in the not too distant future.
Okay. Very last question, Dan. What is the mission of Canadians for Affordable Energy?
Well, what we're doing right now, Nigel, to discuss and have a sober discussion about policies that this government has advocated and ideas around this notion that we can somehow get rid of our energy prowess and that we can somehow abandon the very things that have made Canada unique, attractive, and affordable. And affordability above all. When I left Gas Buddy 5-6 years ago to take on this role from my friend John Williams, I wanted to make sure that what we were saying would happen did in fact take place. Everything that we've talked about, not just with EVs, but this net zero fantasy that we are on, has now come to be true. And for that reason, it is policymakers who have had an uneven hand in determining and shaping what is a very dark future for most Canadians. It's not Canadian. It's certainly not the dream that many Canadians had hoped for. And I want to be, like everyone else, provide an aspirational future that resets this country, puts it back on the right track, and gives the next generation an opportunity to benefit from the vast menu of energy options this country has, which by and large are world-class, very, very much leading, very environmentally conscious, but at the same time taking into consideration what is important to most people: affordable energy.
Well, Godspeed on your mission, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thanks,
Dan
Nigel.
McTeague, President of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us. For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford. Good night.
Great to be here. Thanks, Nigel.
If the name Ted Byfield brings back fond memories, well, we got a party coming up for you guys. On September 25th, Toasting Ted is what it's called. It's going to honor a great conservative who published Alberta Report news magazine. It's going to be bagpipes, singing, live auction stakes, speeches by Premier Smith, Preston Manning, Stephen Harper, quite a lineup. The Western Standard is the final incarnation, or the latest incarnation, of Alberta Report that Ted Byfield founded. And I mean, he was a great Albertan. He really made his mark on this province. And this evening of celebration for him is really going to be outstanding. You get there, toastingted.ca. That's the website. You can get your tickets. This one's going to sell out. I mean, again, if you want to see Smith, Manning, Harper, all in one spot, one night, be sure to get there.